There's been an endless debate since the release of Poltergeist as to who directed the film. On paper it was Tobe Hooper, who'd also written and directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and directed the film adaptation of Stephen King's vampire novel Salem's Lot. But also on paper the film was scripted by Steven Spielberg along with a couple of other writers. Tobe Hooper was not part of the scriptwriting team as far as I know, and on paper the film was produced by Steven Spielberg and Frank Marshall. There are many accounts given of the film shoot by crew members, which I won't go into much detail about as this is going to be a long video anyway, but I will say that there are two factors that appear to be consistent among crew reports. Spielberg was on set most of the time, and Spielberg was producing storyboards for specific scenes, and these storyboards were used as guidance on how the scenes were shot. But Tobe Hooper was an experienced director himself, and he'd written scripts before with co-writer Kim Henkel. So did he really need to have his directorial hand held by Spielberg in terms of shot choices? The presence of Spielberg on storyboard duties is significant. I've never heard of a producer doing this, and typically the director will communicate what he wants with the storyboard artist, and the artist's job is basically to sketch out the director's instructions in a manner that's presentable. Spielberg wouldn't be acting as storyboard artist if his role was only to sketch out Tobe Hooper's ideas. I've never heard of a producer doing that on a film that he's producing. And here's another thing, there doesn't seem to be a credit for Spielberg or anyone else for the storyboarding of this movie, though biographer John Baxter cites that two storyboard artists were used to sketch out Spielberg's ideas. In my view, the only reason Spielberg would hang out on set near enough every day and be involved in producing storyboards for Poltergeist was so that he could indirectly direct the film. He was almost certainly choosing the kinds of shots and camera movements and screen compositions, and Tobe Hooper was then carrying out those artistic decisions in the manner that a second unit director would. Just a year before this, Spielberg directed Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one of that film's greatest scenes was a truck chase that was shot almost entirely by a second unit crew, and in accordance to detailed storyboards drawn up by Spielberg himself. It appears that the same thing was happening with Poltergeist, Spielberg being the central decision maker on the film, and Tobe Hooper probably being allowed to contribute additional artistic decisions. It's a very unusual filmmaking setup, and quite possibly the high quality of the film is a result of this unusual blending of two talents. Hooper, in my opinion, has never been on Spielberg's creative level in terms of technical execution, though he typically lacked the big budgets, but his most famous film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is packed with unspoken themes and subliminal detail. Same with many of Spielberg's movies of the early 80s like E.T., so it can be argued that Hooper in his limited director role probably enhanced Spielberg's vision. One factor in Tobe Hooper's favour is that biographer John Baxter has reported that Hooper had the initial idea for the film and went to Spielberg with it, but there's a catch to that story. Baxter says that Hooper didn't come up with the idea himself. He was working in an office formerly occupied by Robert Wise, the director who had directed a well-known horror movie called The Haunting, and in one of the desks he found some of Wise's research materials and film ideas in a file. He read through them, liked what he saw, and then went to Spielberg with the material. In other words, the genesis of the story came from Robert Wise's production, and Hooper was the middleman. That is, assuming that Baxter's report is true. However, there is another production report factor that ups the argument that Poltergeist is essentially Spielberg's film. Poltergeist was edited by Michael Kahn under Spielberg's supervision, not Tobe Hooper, who was apparently shut out of the editing process. Kahn had a solid working relationship with Spielberg to the point that he had edited Spielberg's 3 previous directorial outings prior to Poltergeist. Those films were Close Encounters, 1941, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. John Baxter's biography includes a report from composer Jerry Goldsmith claiming that Spielberg was the de facto director and that Hooper showed up once in the editing room, sat and watched for a while as Goldsmith and Spielberg worked, then left the room. Biographer John Baxter leans heavily toward the idea that Spielberg was the creative force behind Poltergeist, and he claims that when MGM were first promoting the film, there were trailers that actually showed on-set footage of Spielberg directing until there was some complaint about it and they withdrew the footage, and that's very significant. I haven't seen the footage myself, but Baxter's book does include 2 photos that appear to show Spielberg directing on the set. And I'll also add that John Baxter seems to be a pretty reliable biographer. I mean, I read his biography on Stanley Kubrick and it was very, very good and seemed to match up with a lot of stuff that I already knew about him and matched up with stuff in Vincent Labruto's biography, which was written around the same time. In other words, Baxter and Labruto weren't copying each other, but they both discovered similar materials. But aside from crew reports on the issue, I find it much more interesting to assess the question of who truly directed Poltergeist by comparing the finished movie with the filmographies of Spielberg and Hooper. Hooper was a veteran of the horror genre, having directed 4 horror films before Poltergeist, including the very good TV miniseries Salem's Lot. Spielberg, while not generally being thought of as a horror director, did actually have some directorial experience of the genre too. His first feature film, Duel, was a dark thriller that could also be thought of as a horror film. He directed Jaws, which was certainly a horror film that had a bit of gore and was very effective in scaring audiences. And very importantly, he directed Raiders of the Lost Ark right before Poltergeist. Raiders is ultimately an action-adventure film, but it has very clear supernatural horror elements throughout. Like Poltergeist, it has ghosts and supernatural events signified by bright white light. Consider the opening of the Ark and the ghosts who float down the stairs in Poltergeist. Like Poltergeist, Raiders has corpses that are moved about in a way that makes it difficult to discern if they are moving by themselves or not. Both films have a scene of a female character swarmed by such corpses. Both films reach near enough the same level of gore. Both films include strong winds when supernatural events occur. The direction of supernatural events between Raiders and Poltergeist are incredibly similar, even in terms of special effects techniques, whereas Hooper tended to go for more gore-based horror. The shot choices and camera movements of Poltergeist are more sophisticated than Hooper's other films. They're very much in line with Spielberg's visual style at the time, which tended to use a lot of extreme variation between very wide or long distance views and facial close-ups. There are also plenty of similarities between the direction of otherworldly entities in Spielberg's Close Encounters and Poltergeist, especially the use of very bright light and strobe lighting. Other strong arguments for Spielberg as the unofficial director can be made with regards to how Poltergeist references other films. Spielberg had a habit of doing this. Raiders of the Lost Ark, for example, uses sound effects from the Star Wars films. It was, after all, produced by George Lucas. The droid characters from Star Wars are etched into the tomb where the Ark is kept, and Poltergeist has tons of references to Star Wars in the kids' bedroom. Darth Vader, Yoda, Chewbacca, plus a poster for Alien. A toy version of Han Solo's handgun is in the film too, and a C-3PO face is on the wall here. And a toy TIE fighter is among the objects sucked into the cupboard. These details weren't even in the script, though the script does say that when Carol Ann is sucked into the closet, posters of Darth Vader and R2-D2 get sucked in as well. Remember, Spielberg worked on the script. Although 2 scriptwriters are credited, John Baxter reports that Spielberg wasn't very happy with what they had written and decided to rewrite it himself, during which he fleshed out some of those ideas with Tobe Hooper. The additional Star Wars details on set were likely included at Spielberg's request, which suggests that Spielberg was generally involved with set design and prop choices, as well as storyboarding. Spielberg's next movie after Poltergeist was E.T., and it too contains multiple child's toy references to Star Wars. Tobe Hooper wasn't involved with E.T. Another set of references to other movies that are typical of Spielberg is his references to Stanley Kubrick films. 2 major examples of this are the use of music from 2001: A Space Odyssey at the ending of E.T., and in his 2018 film Ready Player One, a lengthy scene takes place within the Overlook Hotel set piece from Kubrick's The Shining, but I've never seen a Kubrick reference in any Tobe Hooper film, except Poltergeist, in which Spielberg was present, of course. However, in this instance, the Kubrick references are more subtle and open to debate. Room 237 is the ghostly location of a key scene in The Shining, and in Poltergeist, ghosts come out of the TV and into the family home. This occurs when the TV is showing the time as 2:37 AM on Channel 3. In the first TV scene downstairs, the TV is on channel 12, but there's no time. Later, when Caroline is missing and trapped in an alternate dimension, she can be heard through this TV, and the mother says she can be heard better on a certain channel, which happens to be channel 12. And yet the ghosts come through on channel 3 here. So if the number 12 has significance, then so might the number 237. Of course, the 237 could be accidental, but in the second scene, the TV time says 237 in 3 separate camera shots right at the beginning of the scene. On the 4th shot, time jumps ahead to 2:58, but in the 5th shot it jumps back to 2:39. In the 6th shot it jumps back to 2:53, and then it's back to 2:39. So what the hell's going on here? TV time continuity is all over the place, but the first 3 shots from different angles have 2:37 as the time. So my impression is that because all of the times are 2:37 or slightly later, that the crew had specifically reset the TV timer to 2:37 between shots at the beginning of the scene, and for the later shots of the scene had left the timer running and ended up with the time moving forward to various points within the next 20 odd minutes. Most of these shots could easily be done in a 20-minute period, as the lighting remains the same and several of them don't even have the child actress in shot. And here's something that confuses matters even more. It's well known that in the novel of The Shining, the haunted hotel room was numbered 217, but was changed to 237 in Kubrick's film. So we have the 237 time prominent on the TV in Poltergeist, and where do we find a very prominent number 217? Here it is in the final shot of the movie, and that number is on the door to a hotel room. Note how the camera pulls out to make that number prominent. How uncanny is that? Oh, one more comparison between these two films. The Shining ends with a musical score that fades out during the credits so that we're listening to a crowd of mumbling people. Probably either Overlook hotel party guests or a reference to the film's audience itself. I wonder how many people in cinemas assumed that the crowd mumbling on the film was actually the chattering of the audience around them as they left. And in Poltergeist's ending, the music fades out so that we just hear people laughing. It's probably kids because the orchestral music preceding it had kids singing. It's worth noting that immediately after Kubrick was shooting his The Shining in Elstree Studios, Spielberg began shooting scenes from Raiders of the Lost Ark in the very same studio spaces. Baxter's biographies on both Spielberg and Kubrick described them as having on-set contact during the overlap, to the point where Kubrick's daughter Vivienne was insisting on better conditions for the pet snakes used in the Well of the Souls scene from Raiders. And after the Colorado Lounge set from The Shining mysteriously burned down, Spielberg and Lucas arranged for the reconstruction of the soundstage to be several meters higher to facilitate the tall set for the Well of the Souls. And of course the two directors did have a lot of personal contact, to the point that after Kubrick's death, Spielberg directed AI, Artificial Intelligence, a project conceived and storyboarded by Kubrick. In the published artwork book for AI, Spielberg's foreword explains that Kubrick first pitched the AI project to him in 1984, but that they had already been friends for several years. Baxter's reports clash a little bit with Spielberg's assessment though, and Spielberg says that prior to AI, Kubrick had never confided in him about a project before. So I don't think Spielberg had any special access to what went on during the production of The Shining. Maybe he heard a few bits and pieces from various crew members who were there. More likely, he saw the cinematic release of The Shining later and took some inspiration during the production of Poltergeist. Incidentally, the finished movie of AI is packed with subliminal encoding, and undoubtedly Spielberg personally understood a lot of that encoding, being that he directed it. Spielberg is a far more subliminal director than he's been given credit in biographies or news media reviews. Check out my analysis of AI for evidence of that. There's another possibility too, which I think is pretty vague, but I'll mention it anyway. Those of you who've seen my analysis of Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey will be aware of my interpretation that the monolith represents the cinema screen itself rotated 90 degrees, and it's essentially a teaching device for the apes in parallel with the movie itself being a teaching device for the audience. This factor involves apes and astronauts reaching out and touching the monolith. In the end scene, Dave Bowman is trapped in a conceptual room with no exit, and only when he reaches to touch the monolith does the camera break the fourth wall and shift outside of the movie set, followed by intellectually reborn Dave Bowman exiting the room via the monolith as if it's a doorway out of the film narrative. Well, Poltergeist has instances of characters touching a TV as well, which serves as a doorway between dimensions. It's a sketchy parallel between the two films, but considering the number of parallels with The Shining, it might be another of Spielberg's encoded Kubrick references. Who knows? Moving on to less abstract interpretations, Poltergeist has thematic parallels that are common to Spielberg's larger filmography in ways that do not match the filmography of Tobe Hooper. This will all be explored in a lot more detail later in this analysis, so I'll just summarise it for now. The film has a preoccupation with parent-child relationships and the dependency of family members upon each other, the wholesome, close-knit family. Other Spielberg films that explore these are Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which, like Poltergeist, features a child of roughly Carol Ann's age being taken away by outside forces and reunited with mother at the end of the movie. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom includes an adopted child accompanying the lead character, and the two of them hooking up with a wife figure during the story. And other Spielberg films with a heavy emphasis on childhood experiences include The Goonies, AI, Ready Player One, Hook, the Jurassic Park films, and the father-son relationship of Indiana Jones is explored in the third film of that series. And of course, the sentimentality around family bonding that is present in spades in Poltergeist is something Spielberg is renowned for, not that he's limited to that kind of content, of course. Biographies of Spielberg and his interviews about the hidden side of E.T. reveal that the director was preoccupied with these issues because, as a child, he was regularly in fear of his own parents breaking up. So Poltergeist plays very heavily on family breakup and parent-child separation fears. And the casting of a geeky-looking kid as Robbie, the male child in the family, always stood out to me. He actually reminds me a little of Spielberg himself as a child, who had 3 sisters. Robbie has 2 sisters in the film. But perhaps more significant is an observation made by a YouTuber several years ago. The father's name in this fictional family is Steven, and his name is shouted many times in the film.
Steven! Give me Nintendo, Steven! Steven, hurry!
Was this a sneaky reference by Spielberg about his own role in the production? Last thought to round off this chapter. The one scene in the film that feels very much to me like a Tobe Hooper moment is this guy being grossed out by food in a dark kitchen. The steak appears to rot rapidly in front of him, and he drops a piece of chicken from his mouth to the floor and then sees it being full of maggots before he runs and vomits in the sink. Tobe Hooper's most famous movie, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is full of animal rights themes, and he has openly admitted that the film is a big statement against the meat industry. That's why characters are slaughtered like cattle in the movie. But I've never known Spielberg to push any kind of vegetarian agenda in his films, nor does he typically do fleshy body horror like this, but Tobe Hooper often has. And the moment of face-tearing seems more a Tobe Hooper-like scene than a Spielberg one. The rotting steak and maggot-infested chicken were actually in the script though, but the face-tearing wasn't in the script, so it's possible that this could have been a major conceptual contribution from Tobe Hooper on set. I mean, it's certainly one of the most powerful scenes in the movie. However, one factor here that leans in Spielberg's favour is that it's been reported in John Baxter's biography of Spielberg that the hands that rip the flesh away from the prop head are actually Spielberg's hands. But on the whole, as far as I can tell, the evidence all points to Poltergeist being Spielberg's movie, with Hooper essentially playing the same kind of creative role that a second unit director would, perhaps with a little bit more creative input than that though. Though it resulted in a marvellous film, it's not something I consider respectable from either director. Apparently Spielberg was worried that a director's strike would possibly interrupt the film shoot, but it's also reported that he wasn't allowed to direct 2 films at once, being that pre-production on E.T. was well underway. And so we got Tobe Hooper in to essentially pretend to direct so that Steven would be able to continue directing on set and not get in trouble with the industry unions. Of course, if that's the truth, then it will never be openly admitted because of the legal ramifications. But for me, the willingness of the 2 directors to engage in this credit deception says something about their characters. Spielberg really wanted to make this movie to the point that he was willing to hand over credit to another director for his own work. And it did turn out to be one of Spielberg's best movies, and if we were to include it in Hooper's filmography, it would be the very best. It knocks the hell out of anything else that Hooper has done. I half respect Spielberg's position there because it shows that he wasn't in it for the directorial acknowledgement, but I have a lesser view of Tobe Hooper playing that second fiddle role and receiving credit for what was primarily another director's vision. One cast report I read said that he was basically stoned most of the time he was on set, but I don't know how true that is. The whole scenario to me is like plagiarism with permission or something like that, and Poltergeist is certainly way above Hooper's other movies in terms of technical and artistic quality. I guess it kinda leaves a bad taste in my mouth.